Today, I want to reveal the #1 thing that'll avoid you getting stuck more than anything else in the aftermarket industry. Now, you're probably thinking maybe diff locks, maybe big tyre suspension lifts, ute chops, reduction gears. I'm not sure what you're thinking, but if you are thinking those things, you're wrong, because this right here is what I'm talking about. This is a humble stick, and this stick will help you let your tyres down. I'm talking about tyre pressures. Now, obviously, tyre deflators come in much more sophisticated versions than this, but even this stick will do the trick to get those tyres down to an operating level whereby you can drive tough terrains and not get stuck. Now today, we're going to put it to the ultimate challenge. We're going to find out scientifically what tyre pressures should be used in what terrains. We're going to go through a series of different challenges from dirt roads, corrugations, ruts, mud and rocks. And we're going to basically find out what tyre pressures you should run in what terrain and when. And that way, you'll get stuck a heck of a lot less. I think the best way to demonstrate the difference between road pressures and what you run off-road is to visually show that. And to do that, we're going to do a little bit of arts and crafts. We're going to get a bit of cardboard and actually paint the tread of the tyre at 40 PSI, lower it onto the cardboard so you can see the footprint that the tyre leaves behind on the road. And then we're going to lower this down to 20 PSI and do the same and show you the difference. I think it's important to break down the results a little bit. Here at 40 PSI, you're probably shocked into thinking that there's not much rubber on the ground, and you'd be right. For a tyre this size, that is a very small amount of rubber. So I guess it really reinforces why when we let our tyres down, it makes a huge difference off-road. Now, at 20 PSI, you'll see that there's a lot more rubber on the ground, but in particular, pay attention to the length of rubber. 210 mil versus 170. The widths are very similar, but the length at 20 PSI gives you that huge advantage. Now, you can imagine dropping that down to 15 PSI or even 10 PSI, that would actually get even more exaggerated, giving you way better traction off-road. I think the best way to really appreciate what happens to your tyre when you deflate it off-road to get more traction is to look at an exaggerated example. Now, take a tractor, for example, a small front tyre, a really tall, large rear tyre. Those things never get bogged. Now, the thing is, it's not how thick the tyres are, because in some cases they're thinner or not much thicker than a four-wheel drive tyre. What you're looking for is the length of tread that is on the ground. So this rear tyre here, it has a huge amount of tread on the ground at one time, therefore giving it stacks traction. Now, if you look at another exaggerated example, take an excavator or a bulldozer with big tracks. Now, the length on the ground, of course, is immense, therefore those things never really get stuck. So you can imagine when you're letting your tyres down, it's not about the width of the tyre that's on the sand, it's about the length. The more length you have on the ground, well, the more traction you're going to have. You can see here where you put the GoPro inside this Goodyear Wrangler, at different pressures, the tyre reacts very differently when driving over this rock. At 40 PSI, there's also no indent seen. At 20 and 15 PSI, you can see the tyre morphs itself right over the obstacle. Another thing you need to consider when lowering your tyres off-road is the longevity and also protecting your tyres, because at 40 PSI, as you can see from this balloon here, there doesn't have a lot of give. Now, you imagine when you're riding over rocks and logs and things out in the scrub that your tyre needs to mould over those things so it doesn't break. Now, look at this balloon, which is roughly about half the size. We're going to call this one 20 PSI. It's quite malleable. It's going to roll over things. This one here, well, it's a lot firmer. So we'll see what happens when you've got like a rock or a big sharp stick off-road. When you hit that one, oh, it takes a little bit for it to go. When you've got the 40 PSI one, as you can imagine, it doesn't take much at all. There's a tiny little touch on that and game over. You can see here just how much more the tyre moulds itself around the tree stump at a lower pressure, meaning more traction and less likelihood of the tyre being damaged. And once again, you can see the same with this rock. A lower tyre pressure means more traction and less pressure on a tyre at the point of impact, meaning less likelihood of damage. Another way to see the difference is here. Starting at 15 PSI, you can see just how bagged out the tyre is over this rock. Now, as we inflate the tyre up to 40 PSI, you can see the effect the tyre pressure has and how it moulds itself around the rock, Same goes here. You can see as the tyre pressure is increased, so does the amount of rubber on the road decrease. Righto, we've seen in theory the difference between tyre pressures, but how does that relate off-road in the real world? First up, let's see the difference on the sand. Well, what a glorious day. I'm just jumping down on the beach here, and you wouldn't believe it, but I've got 40 PSI still in my tyres. Now, I've got highway pressures in there. Normally you wouldn't do this, but for demonstration purposes, I've got 40 PSI. Not only that is, instead of being on this hard sand right here, I'm gonna head up into the soft sand and see what happens. Oh, and straight away, you can feel the vehicle just doing its best. It's working really hard to push me through. Oh, she's bogging down. Yep. I could tell that was going to happen. 40 PSI up in the soft sand. Well, big heavy vehicle. She's gone straight down. But now I'm going to take those tyre pressures down to 20 PSI and see if I can't just drive straight out. All right, now let's see what difference that makes. Tyres are all down to 20 PSI, so pretty good starting point on the beach normally. Let's see what happens. Righto, fingers crossed. Look at that, straight out. There we go, it's an absolute breeze to drive up here now. The other thing to note, now I've got 20 PSI in those tyres, the vehicle is working so much easier to get through. Now that's a big thing, not a lot of people really, worry about when they're on the beach. They think, oh heck, I've got my tyres up and I don't get stuck. But it's how much stress is your vehicle going through. My engine, my diffs, my drivetrain, everything, the gearbox is having a lot less stress put upon it because it's so much easier to roll over that soft sand with 20 PSI on my tyres compared to 40. Now, I'm at 20 PSI right now, and I'm finding with the weight of this vehicle and this soft sand, it's a perfect combination. Now, this is not a hard and fast rule for driving on the sand. You'll see every single beach is different. Sometimes you're gonna get it way softer sand than this, and you might have a lighter vehicle. There's so many different combinations, I suppose. Now, the way you're gonna find out if your tyres are set at the right pressure is do the little stop maneuver. That's what I like to call it, where basically you're driving along the beach, you take your foot off the accelerator, and your vehicle should come to a rolling stop rather than an abrupt stop. If it comes to a nice rolling stop and rolls a couple of meters before it actually comes to a stop, your tyre pressures are actually perfect. So I'm going to demonstrate right up here. Right, I'm going to take my foot off the accelerator now. As you can see, it's still rolling. That's a good 5-6 meters at least, maybe even more. Still rolling, and just a nice, subtle, gentle stop. Still actually just rolling right now. It's in drive, that's why. It just shows that those tyre pressures are absolutely perfect for this soft sand. All right, so I've pumped the tyres back up to 40 PSI to prove this point. I'm gonna come off the throttle right now. Whoa, so it's like I've put the foot on the brake. The vehicle's just come to an abrupt halt. Now that's 40 PSI on the tyres. It shows that the tyre's not rolling freely over the sand. It's coming to an abrupt stop. That means that your vehicle is digging down and you're more likely to get stuck, of course. So let's see if I can take off without getting bogged. Just. Alright guys, I've jumped into Sooty now, and this is the vehicle I typically drive harder tracks with. Now, when you find yourself in a situation off-road where you want to drive, I don't know, mud, big rocks, ruts, all of that really technical low-range stuff, you'll want to take your tyre pressures down. One of the things I find, if you don't take your tyre pressures down, it's going to be a very, very hard ride. Not to mention, you're not going to get the traction you're going to need. So the hard ride is going to make it a lot more damaging on your vehicle. So it's best to take the time to take those pressures down. A lot of people will be asking, where do you start? Well, typically when I'm driving tough stuff, I'm going to go down to around 20 PSI to begin with, and even lower at times depending on if it's really thick mud. I'll take it down even further, but 20 is a really good starting point. So up in front of me, I've got this rut where it's quite off cambered, a lot of clay. It's going to be a little bit slippery. I'm going to idle up 40 PSI, see what happens. What I think will happen is that I'll lose traction and I'll stop climbing pretty quickly. Now I'm purposely going at just about 1,500 RPM, so sort of idling up here. Got probably more traction than I anticipated, but this little bit here will be quite challenging as I try and climb at the same time. Oh, it's mate. There you go. Everything's so much harsher on the drivetrain too. You can feel that's not doing old Sooty any favours. It's really harsh and abrupt. Every time you hit an obstacle and slide off a bank into another rut, it's certainly not smooth, and long and short of it is, I didn't climb that hill as well. So I'm going to go down the bottom here and air down. We'll see what sort of difference that makes. All right, air down is complete. Sitting down at about 20 PSI. So essentially I've taken half the air out of the tyres. You'll see that will hopefully make a big difference off-road. Righto. How good's that? I made it up, and more importantly, it was quite smooth as well, I found. It makes such a huge difference letting those tyres down. Here's something I want to make mention of that I guess worries a lot of people about letting their tyre pressures down. They're worried about, with standard rims, rolling a tyre off a rim. Now, of course, that's a strong possibility when you do let your tyres down too low. So the big question is, how low is too low? I strongly believe that you're not going to take a tyre off the bead, you're not going to roll a tyre off the rim if you drive in a straight line and without any erratic movement. So if you're on a beach and you really need to let your tyres down, you're still stuck, you're at 20 PSI, you're at 18, you're at 15, and it's still not getting off that soft sand, well, let them down even further. I've let them down to, just on normal rims, below 10 PSI. That's really bagged out, and guess what? Driving in a straight line, you're not going to roll that tyre off the rim. But of course, if you're going to be doing some pretty crazy full driving up big rock steps and stuff, using a fair bit of right pedal to get you through, well then at those sort of low pressures without beadlock rims, you do run a real risk of getting that tyre off the rim. So, you know, horses for courses, I suppose, but don't be too shy about rolling a tyre off the wheel by simply letting a bit of pressure out, because if you drive normally, it's not going to happen. Driving over these corrugations with 40 PSI in the tyres. First thing you notice is the vehicle, well, you know, for a pretty comfortable vehicle, it's 200, it does shake around a heck of a lot. That's only at 60 k's an hour too. 65 k's an hour over these corrugations. It's just shaking the vehicle quite a bit. You can hear it shaking around. Certainly not a comfortable drive. So, add the old tyres down to 20 PSI and to see what sort of difference that's going to make on these hard corrugations. And as you can tell, very quiet and very refined in the cab here. Look, I'm hitting some big ones now. Look at that. That, you could do that all day. A lot of the dampening is actually happening in the tyre, opposed to on the chassis, drive line, and all the components of the tray and vehicle. So it does make sense that when you do hit the dirt roads, you want those tyres down a little bit. The only time you want road pressures is on the road. When it comes to driving on dirt roads, and in Australia we're lucky enough to do a lot of this sort of travelling, a lot of people don't even, you know, let their tyres down because they run their highway pressures and their vehicle will literally shake itself to pieces. Yeah, right here, oh, the stacks of big corrugations right through here. But I find that if I let my tyres down to about 26, 28 PSI, that's a sweet spot for me. It's still got enough pressure in there so I can corner, it handles really well the vehicle, but it does take the shaking out of it, especially when I hit good corrugations. I know we've all done it, been out forward driving and then snuck into town or home without putting our tyre pressures back up. The problem is, incorrect tyre pressures is one of the leading causes of really bad tyre wear. While you're driving with a low tyre pressure, your tyre is expanding and contracting hundreds of times a minute. All this movement creates friction and friction creates heat. Not only is the rubber heating up, but also the steel belts. This heat will slowly degrade the rubber over time. So let's break this down. The more deflated your tyres, the more give they have, which means more movement, which means more friction. The more friction generated, the more heat created. And the more heat created, the faster your tyre degrades and the more wear on your tyres. It's also dangerous to have your tyres overinflated. Remember back to my art class earlier in this video, the more pressure, the less tyre is in contact with the road, meaning the middle wears too fast and you don't have enough grip. It might be annoying to pump your tyres back up, but it's definitely the best thing to do. Stop for 5 minutes, hook up the air compressor and have a stretch and thank yourself for giving your tyres an extra few months of life. Well, if this test has taught us one thing, it's taught us that altering your tyre pressure is going to make a huge difference off-road. Not just the performance of how you drive off-road and the further you'll get before getting bogged, it's also going to protect your tyres and your four-wheel drive. And if you ask me, they are very significant investments. Now, the fundamentals remain the same. It doesn't matter what terrain you're in, you really need to adjust those tyre pressures. And you're going to find out yourself once you get onto the sand or get onto the dirt to make slight adjustments to make sure your vehicle drives the best it possibly can and you can get further off-road. Now, for me, I think it's the best mod you can possibly make to a vehicle. Number one, because it's free, and number two, it's so darn easy to let your tyres down. I mean, heck, you can use a little stick you found on the side of the road, or you can get a little bit more fancy tyre deflator and do it in just a couple of minutes. You'll have your tyres at the optimal pressure. Speaking of which, I need to get the compressor out, pump mine back up because I've got a date with an Outback pub. Anyway, I'll see you around next time.